G'day folks, and welcome back to the channel for a quick video tutorial on Grim Dawn's components system. This is a topic I've been meaning to do a video on for months now, because when I was looking for this information when I was a newbie to Grim Dawn, the only videos I could find on it were terribly outdated, and they were still discussing things like partial components, which don't exist anymore. Do note as well that this video does not cover augments, which are similar to components, but they are a separate thing. They are both little trinkets that you add onto your gear, but every piece of gear you have, except for your relic, can have both an augment and a component, and they stack. You don't have to choose one or the other, you get to have both. Before I get too far into this video, I want to make a quick note here that you are going to be picking up thousands of components during the course of your adventures, and clicking on every single one of them will probably wear out both your mouse and your finger. Good news though is that if you come here to the options, you can go to auto loot materials here, which says check to automatically collect components, consumables, and crafting materials when you step near them. This will save you so many clicks. Please check your options and make sure it is turned on. So, what are components? Components are little one-by-one items that you can add onto your equipment. If you take a look at my Death Knight's gear here, you'll see every piece of gear has a little icon down here in the bottom corner of the picture. Those are the components I'm using, and there's one on every piece of gear because this is a finished build. Specific details on which components I'm using for this build don't really matter here, as you'll have to juggle them a bit depending on the rules of your gear anyway, and we're not discussing Death Knight builds. So there are three main sources for components. The first source is random drops. You kill a zombie, he might drop you a Searing Ember. You kick a tree over, it might have a chilled steel in it. You will get literally thousands of components like this in a single character's trip through the campaign. If it drops on the floor, and it isn't one specific component I'm going to discuss in a second, you can essentially treat it as free to use and not worth saving. If it benefits your builds in any way, even very minor, throw it onto your gear for the bonuses, then sell it with the item later. You'll be selling stacks of hundreds of Searing Embers by the time you hit 100. That one special component I was talking about earlier is this one here, Kilrian's Shattered Soul. Unless I'm misremembering, and I've checked, this is the only component that drops specifically as a component and specifically only from one monster and nowhere else. That monster being Kilrian, who lives in the deepest depths of the Arkovian Undercity. If you're playing a fire or vitality damage build, this could be quite good for you, though it is competing for your chest slot, which has some very nice and very powerful components available exclusively for the chest. The second and third source of components are both via crafting at blacksmiths using blueprints. Blueprints can be obtained via two major ways, the first of which is from the various factions of Cairn. Each of the major factions will have a quartermaster in one of their bases, like this one here in Devil's Crossing. Here you can buy blueprints for various items, including components. Once you've bought the blueprint, simply right-click it, and now your blacksmiths will be able to craft whatever that item is. The other way of obtaining blueprints is via drops. Some are general drops that can come from almost any boss, and others are monster-specific that will only drop from either one specific boss, or maybe 2 or 3 specific bosses will share a drop. If you're new enough for this first part of the guide to be useful for you, just be aware that you can get blueprints via totems and treasure troves, as well as drops from some bosses. Also be aware that any guide you might be following should only be using components from recipes you can guaranteed buy from the various factions. Relying on drop-only recipes to actually drop is going to end in a bad time for everyone. Okay, enough with the live-action read-through of the game manual. What components should you actually use? First up, a disclaimer. This little section is going to be for general purpose uses only and is generally targeting newer players, so they get a basic set of components that will help them out for leveling. I'm aware that there are uses for other components that I'm not going to mention here, but your hipster build's oddball component list isn't going to help a new player starting their first character with a very basic Death Knight. So just know that there are other components, and this is an all-purpose generalist setup. Okay, so my first suggested setup comes online at level 15 to 20 or so. You'll first have to rescue Angrim the blacksmith and choose to side with either him or his apprentice. Once you've done that, you'll have access to some crafted components. I usually get these components done around the end of Act 1, but almost always before I set foot into Act 2. You can, however, choose to make these earlier if you have the supplies to do it, and once you have rescued the blacksmith. So, go to your blacksmith and you're going to craft these items in this order. First ones are going to be 2 resilient platings, which you are then going to turn into 2 silk swatches. Silk swatches go in your shoulders, legs, and chest slots only, and provide piercing and bleeding resistances. These are going to be very important in early Act 2 and going forwards, because everything that has a gun or a crossbow is probably doing piercing damage, and a lot of Crunley's gangs have guns. Put the silk swatches into your shoulders and leg slots. Next up, craft 1 scaled hide. Scaled hide also goes into shoulders, legs, or chest slots only. They provide increased armor on that one particular slot and increases your armor absorption percentage for all of your slots. You want the extra armor in your chest, as that's the body location you'll be getting hit on most often, so more armor there is better. Scaled hide into your chest. After those, you are going to want 1 anti-venom salve. This will provide poison resistance and some localized armor and a little bit of regen. This component will go on your belt. Belt armor value is applied to every slot, so increasing it increases all your other slots as well. Poison and acid resistance is a good one to have as well, and the only real alternatives for your belt are single element resistances, which I like to pretend don't exist. Next up, if you have enough aether crystals, you're going to want 2 ward stones. Ward stones will go in your amulet and metal slots. They provide elemental resistances as well as bleeding resistance and some move speed. If you don't have enough aether crystals, and maybe even if you think you do, trust me you don't, you can take the rift gate to the Warden's laboratory and run backwards. There are many aether crystals just waiting to be harvested here. If you still don't have enough, exit to the main menu and restart your game. When you come back in, all of the aether crystals will have respawned. The last thing you're going to want to craft will require level 20, and exactly which one you want will depend on your character, specifically what type of damage you're doing and what weapons you are using. I'm talking about your weapon slots, or your shield if you're having a shield. So if you're doing a fire damage build, you'll want to make 1 or 2 enchanted flints, depending if you have 1 or 2 weapons. These will give you auras that you can place on your hotbar and activate, and will give you extra fire damage. There are different auras for most, but not all damage types. But do note that some of them have item restrictions. For example, Hell's Bane ammo for lightning damage can only go onto guns or caster offhands. My Death Knight here is an aether damage build, and so you can see there I am using Wrath Stones, and the auras from those components are here, the aether weapons granted by items. So if you can't find one for your damage type, or your damage type only goes onto weapons you're not using, I'd recommend making 1 purified salt and 1 imbued silver. These will give you buffs that increase your aether and chaos resistances, and are better than an empty slot. So that's your starting components, and they will serve you well for most of the game with a few extras thrown in. Those extras will require some shopping, and that shopping will require some reputation. So get to questing. The only other dropped components I would suggest for a baseline setup are soul shards. These are little pink or purple crystals, and they start dropping in Act 2, and they go on your rings. I'll go through some of my favorite reputation components here and where to get them. So all of these are available with respected status with the various reputations. So first up, from right here in Devil's Crossing, is the Aether Soul. This component will help greatly in fighting ethereals, giving aether resistance as well as reducing the damage you take from ethereals and aether constructions. It goes into your amulet and metal slots, and it's usually what I replace ward stones with, sometime around Homestead, maybe a little bit later. Just be ready to lose a bunch of elemental resistances when you do replace them, because you'll be losing the ward stones. Next up from the Rovers, and again at Respected, you've got Runestones. This one goes in your helmet. and is very similar to the Aether Soul in that it helps you against ethereals. But this one lets you do more damage to them instead of taking less from them. It still provides Aether resistances and also adds some elemental resistances to boot. This is a little bit expensive, requiring 12 Aether crystals for each one. Next up from the rovers, and I would kind of recommend getting this one later because it is very expensive. But this is the Mark of Mogdrogan. It's very expensive. It's basically an upgraded Mark of the Traveler, which should be on your boots as soon as they start dropping in Act 2. But this is going to cost you 4 Marks of the Traveler, as well as the equivalent of 48 Aether Crystals. That'll get you 1 Mark of Mogdrogan. Like I said, they are very, very expensive. From Homestead, you've got the Sanctified Bone here, which is effectively a runestone, but for Chthonians instead of ethereals. It can also go in the chest slot, and it is hideously expensive for when you get it, but it will help with chaos and vitality resistances. Ironically, you've got to kill a lot of Chthonians to get the seals of binding that you would need to make this component, so you can then kill them a little bit safer and faster. And lastly, from the Order of Death's Vigil, or Kaiman's Chosen, but who sides with those fools, am I right? You'll get the Black Tallow. This is a Chaos version of the Aether Soul, goes in the same slots, has the same bonuses, just slightly different flavor. This is also very expensive to craft when you get access to it. These are more or less the only components that I would recommend buying as a sort of you need to get these kind of basis. The other component I would recommend is this one here, the Prismatic Diamond. This one requires either a random drop or it requires a lot of shopping in one of the game's skeleton key dungeons, specifically the Ancient Grove. You will need to go in, find the merchant who is in the Ancient Grove, and then run from him to the next floor, count to 10, run all the way back, check if he has this recipe. When he doesn't have it, run all the way back to the door to the next floor, go through, count to 10, and then run back and rinse and repeat until you find the recipe. Having said that, this Prismatic Diamond goes in your head armor, gives you more health, absorbs enemy spells to give you energy, has some vitality resistances, but the reason why I recommend doing this, and I do recommend the running back and forth until you get this for most people, is the granted skill there, Prismatic Rage. When your health drops below 50%, for 8 seconds you will reduce all incoming damage after armor and resistances by 130. You also get some total speed, which includes attack speed, casting speed, and movement speed, and you get some extra damage. But that 130 damage absorption will save your life. Now, the last thing I want to do in this particular video is provide a real example of a character that I played in hardcore. So this is the level 48 snapshot of my Cold Trozen Skyshard Spellbreaker, and this is what I was doing at that point in time. So some of these I'm just going to run through quickly because they're exactly what I told you I would be doing. First one is the Aether Soul on the metal. Then you have a Silk Swatch on the pants. You have a Scaled Hide on the chest. I have dual Cold Stones on the weapon and shield. This is a cold damage build, so I'm using the cold damage components. I have soul shards on both of the rings. Now, you're not guaranteed to get soul shards. I have had some characters where I didn't have any soul shards until sort of late in Act 4. If that happens to you, you have another option here in the Corpse Dust. Some people prefer Corpse Dust. I prefer the 20% vitality resistance on the soul shard. If you're happy with only 10%, then the Corpse Dust could be better because it will give you health and regen, whereas the Soul Shard will give you more resistance and it will help with absorbing energy from hostile spells. On the amulet here, I do still have a Wardstone. I believe the reason I'm still using a Wardstone here is because I actually ran out of Aether Crystals, so I couldn't make another Aether Soul. I believe I did end up farming up those crystals, and I did swap that to an Aether Soul. You kind of have to judge based on what your resistances are at the time. If I swap this Wardstone off right now, it would uncap my bleeding resistance by 2% and have no effect on the elemental ones. But having an extra Aether Soul would take my Aether resistance from 63% to, what, 79? Yeah, 79%, which is much closer to the cap. And going from 63 to 79% is basically means I would be taking half of the amount of Aether damage on any hits. So that would be a huge bonus for me. And like I said, I believe the only reason I hadn't already done it at this point is that I ran out of Aether Crystals to craft them. On your boots here, you're definitely going to want a Mark of the Traveler until you get the Mark of Mogdrogen, which is very expensive. Just use a Mark of the Traveler. It's not a big difference. You can use Mark of the Traveler all the way up to level 100 with no problem. On the gloves here, you've got a couple of choices. So I'm using Consecrated Wrappings here at this point in time. That is there entirely for that 8% Chaos resistance. The flat Chaos damage and attack speed does not apply to my build at all. I am wearing that component entirely for that 8% Chaos resistance. If you don't need Chaos resistance though, I would recommend one of these two. So Unholy Inscription is going to provide you with some Vitality resistance and some Bleeding resistance, which, if you don't need those, go with the Spellwoven Threads. More damage, so Spirit, offensive, and casting speed. If you don't need those, there is one additional Restless Remains here you can buy from the Rovers. This is again at Respected, and if you're playing a melee character, this will give you some lifesteal, it will give you a chunk of extra energy, and probably the casting speed is not going to be useful, but this is also an option. As a general baseline component though, the Consecrated Wrappings are generally my go-to for the Chaos resistance. Now on the shoulders, I said you should have a Silk Swatch, and this is another case of juggling what you have available when you need it. So I have 20 poison and acid resistance from this anti-venom salve here. If I didn't have that, my poison and acid resistance would be uncapped. And putting another Silk Swatch on here would do nothing for me. That only gives me pierce and bleeding resistance, and they are both already capped. So there's no point going past the cap until ultimate. So a Silk Swatch does me no good here, and this anti-venom salve does allow me to cap my poison and acid resistance, which would otherwise not be capped. So there you have it. This is a real pretend world example of what I actually do during a playthrough of a character that I'm currently leveling in Hardcore SSF. Like I said, if you want to see this character in action, the playlist is available on this channel. Now, what I've shown here in this video is not an extensive and exhaustive rundown of all the components in the game. There are many, many more that are available, and of the ones I did show here, almost none of them will be used in an optimized endgame build. But these are very good components. This is a very good setup for leveling, and they are the ones that will get you to 100. Also note that, like I said, you will have to juggle components depending on what you need at the time. The character I showed here swapped frequently between Wardstones and Aether Souls, depending if I needed Aether resistance or Elemental and Bleeding, and actually did use Black Tallow as well on the Amulet and the Medal. Again, if I need Chaos resistance and I don't need Aether, then I want the Black Tallow. But I was frequently running out of Aether Crystals. I had to go farm them on several occasions, same with the Sigils of Chthon. I had to go farm those a couple times as well. With that said though, this tutorial on getting started with components is over. So thank you all very much for watching. I'll see you in the next one, and goodbye for now.